Hey everyone, it is a great honor to be here with all of you tonight, and thank you, Dick, for those kind words, and thanks for reminding everyone about the Bowling Hall of Fame. I realize, of course, we're fairly close to where Lincoln delivered that speech, which means there's probably a statute of limitation on the time of this speech, so we can get stuck right into it. Tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about making public memory, because as Dick said, I've been at this for about 35 years, and there seemed to be no end of requests to memorialize, and it's not an easy thing to do, but I'd like to try to give you a little bit of insight as to how we actually go about this. As I started gearing up to write something about this event, I started receiving drafts of documents from others who are also participating here tonight, which means that much of what we discussed, and therefore much of what I might have said, is now at least partially contained within their documents, which begs the question, did I have anything left to say? I'm delighted that people think enough of our conversations to want to incorporate bits and pieces into talks to a wider audience. But it left me bereft for a time, especially when you consider, for a moment, the many thousands of volumes in print on the subject of everything Lincoln. You might think this makes it easy, so much material to work from. But actually it's just the opposite. The sheer volume of material suggests how little one probably knows about the man, his life, and his political footprint. This therefore became a daunting place to start yet another sculpture of Abraham Lincoln, especially at Gettysburg. But I do know something about developing an image of mythic and important individuals like Lincoln. We start with some basic questions, metrics and measurements. When available, some serious analytical thinking to get the ball rolling, and then much depends on an intuitive response to the individual that we're about to take on, as it were. Ford's Theater shared their files on the clothing that Lincoln wore when he was shot on that night in April of 1865. And the National Museum of American History in Washington invited us in to measure one of Lincoln's frock coats and his iconic top hat, now coated with a film of arsenic to prevent mold from destroying that amazing object. And we then developed a drawing of what the sculpture might look like and created a working model to inform an enlargement. In the end, the sculpture would take more than a year in design and development, and no less than 20 different individuals had a hand in its creation, from historians and curators to sculptors, costume specialists, foundry men and women. But these beginning steps do not account for the difficulty that lay ahead. It's one thing to sketch, it's quite another thing to render. And as one defines the essence of your subject, the wrestling with a newly created reality is suddenly at hand and the process slows. My friend, Dr. Amy Gamar, acting instructional dean of Arts and Humanities at Montgomery College in Maryland, who is here with us tonight and writing for the forthcoming exhibition, Lincoln, One Man, Two Views, opening next February, said this: "The difficulty of capturing Lincoln's likeness in painting and sculpture has been the subject of much discussion. Walt Whitman famously observed, 'I know of no satisfactory picture of Lincoln. All sorts of pictures exist, many of them good in themselves. Good as pictures, yet all of them wanting in the last, the essential touch.' Writing about the painter, Marsden Hartley's fascination with Lincoln, art historian Randall R. Griffey noted, 'It was the president's perceived enigmatic personality that drew many artists, including Hartley, to the subject of Lincoln. Yet, as Griffey further observed, the flood tide of likenesses deprives any single image of Lincoln the honor and authority of capturing the real man. Thus his image betrays the inadequacy of representation as an index of truth. That is to say, Lincoln himself may have been honest, as one of his popular nicknames suggests, but individual images of him are not, at least not entirely. Noted Lincoln historian Carl Sandburg who wrote extensively about the president's life, commented on the complexity of Lincoln's character in the address he gave to the joint session of Congress on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth on February 12, 1959. In that address, Sandberg stated, "Not often in the story of mankind does a man arrive on earth who is both steel and velvet, who is as hard as a rock and soft as drifting fog, who holds in his heart and mind the paradox of terrible storm and peace unspeakable and perfect." In our own day, leading Lincoln historian Harold Holzer has observed that it was Lincoln's friend and private secretary John Nicolai who remarked no photograph or painting could render even an approximate representation of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's features were the despair of every artist who undertook his portrait. Artists put into their pictures the large, rugged features and strong, prominent lines. They made measurements to obtain exact proportions. They petrified some single look, but the picture remained hard and cold. This was not he who smiled, spoke, laughed, and charmed. There are many pictures of Lincoln, there is no portrait of him. In the 19th century, and well into the 20th century, sculptors went to extraordinary lengths to further their own careers by producing important Lincoln sculpture commissions. No matter who they were, however, even the best eventually exhausted the Lincoln storyline, a direct function of the prevailing attitudes towards Lincoln himself and issues of race. After his death, Lincoln was depicted as the great emancipator, but this ended as a sculptural genre with Reconstruction's end in 1877, giving rise to the enduring image of Lincoln as the savior of the Union. Of the more than 600 sculptures devoted to the American presidency, more than a third of that number are of Abraham Lincoln, and 27 have been produced since the year 2000, proving only that sculptors still make a staunch effort to develop what James Percoco, historian and high school teacher, calls public memory, especially in the case of Abraham Lincoln. But public memory, as we all know, can in the fullness of time also become popular memory, loaded with myth and inaccuracy, and even in the case of Father Abraham. And lately, I've been reflecting on 9/11. This year, on the anniversary of that event, I was sitting in the studio in New York City, listening to a radio broadcast coming from Lower Manhattan, an annual event now of the reading of the names of those who perished on that terrible day. I was struck by something as I heard all of those family members and loved ones reading the names of those who were lost. I heard an almost palpable need to speak directly to the dead. The entreaties by the hundreds broke my heart, and all I could think was that those left behind and the nature of sudden death causes us to want to continue the conversation with those who are lost to us. So why conjure recent tragedy? I think we continue the conversation with Lincoln. You see, I think the nature of Lincoln's death and physical deterioration suggests something that we as a nation continue to be at least a little haunted by. It's interesting to think we've made him Father Abraham and the savior of the Union and the great emancipator today. He's become our leader for all time. We the people seek something in our leadership that is rarely satisfied, and in the long dead Lincoln, we can bundle our hopes and dreams with our own commonly held values and identify the one individual we yearn to put our trust in 144 years after his death. You could say that in the context of contemporary life, he is a safe vessel. Patrick White, the Australian Nobel laureate, said, "Inspiration descends only in flashes to clothe circumstances." And I'm sure this can be said of the work we produce at StudioEIS. I wonder if this wasn't also the case in Lincoln's life. No recent leader, with the possible exception of the deeply flawed but hugely popular wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill, evokes a national pride equal to that of Lincoln, and maybe the reference to wartime is key to the whole thing. The sculpture is meant to render Lincoln in November of 1863 with the full burden of war on his back. I leave it to you to decide if we even came close in our attempt, and ask you to reflect on the nature of memorialization